Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Profitable Pastures 2025. This is our third and final webinar of the spring. I am Birgit Martin. I am the chair of the Ontario Forage Council. We would like to take the opportunity to recognize our conference sponsors. These are the sponsors for all three of our Profitable Pastures webinars. That is Beef Farmers of Ontario and Royal LePage, RCR Realty. And this evening, our sponsor specifically for our speaker is Ontario Sheep Farmers. And that brings us to our speaker for this evening. That is Christine O'Reilly. She is the Forage and Grazing Specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness. Her focus is on improving the productivity and profitability of forage crops. She sees a lot of opportunity for ruminant livestock farms to improve their margins through good grazing management. Christine joined the ministry in 2017 and is based out of the Lindsay office. So, Christine, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Birgit. I'm excited to share this talk with you all this evening because this one is actually a request that came in from attendees from last year. So both of those are rather large topics, and we don't have time to go into all of the little nuanced details that make these different than grazing beef cattle. So tonight, I just want to hit on the number one most common question or biggest issue that I see when I talk to sheep farmers, and the number one that I see when I talk to are usually organic or grass-fed dairy farmers. Many of you may already have realized that a lot of the grazing recommendations we have in Canada were developed through research on the Canadian prairies. So while I think we've done a great job of adapting those recommendations to the wetter climate we have in Ontario and to the tame species that we tend to grow here rather than the native rangeland out west, sometimes we don't talk enough about how grazing different livestock classes or different livestock species can also impact what those recommendations should look like. All right, so I am going to switch gears into dairy. And the most common concern I hear from predominantly organic and grass-fed dairy farmers who are grazing their lactating herds is that they sometimes have a hard time maintaining milk components, particularly through the summer. So that whole production piece on grass can be difficult. And I'm not a dairy nutritionist, but the two things that I know about dairy nutrition are that starch drives milk volume because the rumen microbes turn starch into lactose, and the lactose concentration in milk is pretty much constant. So the more starch you have in a diet, the more lactose you have, and therefore the more liters of milk you get. In contrast, digestible fiber drives milk components. So that's the fat and the protein. And pastures are really bad at starch. They're just not naturally a starch-rich feed source. But if they're managed well, pastures can be very good at digestible fiber. So I think probably the best thing is to leave all the starch stuff to the nutritionist to deal with in the barn and focus on really managing that pasture for digestible fiber during the grazing season to help make sure that we have those components. So if you look at the two photos on this slide, one of them is very digestible, and one of them is indigestible. And I'm just going to give you a second to think about which one's which before we talk about them. All right. Hopefully you guessed right that the one on the left here is pretty indigestible. We've got a lot of mature grasses. They've put out seed heads, and that stem holding up the seed head is very lignified. Lignin is an indigestible fiber. Ruminants can't break it down very well. Whereas the photo on the right is leafy and it's green and it's in a vegetative growth state rather than a reproductive growth state, right? And it's probably very high in sugar and protein and digestible fiber because it's mostly leaf rather than mostly stem. So when it comes to grazing dairy cows or feeding dairy cows at all, Dairy cows don't work to get their feed. They feed to get to work. Okay? We don't make dairy cows work hard in a barn to get the nutrition that they need. So I really struggle with any dairy pastures that look like this photo on the left. Because while cows are excellent at finding the highest quality forage in a field, if we put something like this in front of a dairy cow, she is going to be spending more of her time searching and sorting and less of her time eating and ruminating. And it's the latter two that are making milk. So really, it's important for most of our classes of livestock to try to maintain pastures in a vegetative state for as much of the growing season as we can, but it's absolutely critical for animals with a high plane of nutrition, like lactating dairy cows or any grass finishing of beef or lambs that we might be doing. So we don't want her working too hard. We really want to give her high quality forage when she's out on the pasture. And yeah, trying to keep it vegetative as much as possible is really the goal so that she can focus on making milk. And the best tool to do that, surprise, surprise, is stocking density. So stocking density is how much area we give grazing animals at a point in time. So for a single grazing event. And people often confuse stocking density with stocking rate. They're not the same thing. Stocking rate is how much pasture those animals have over time, so like over the grazing season. So to help you conceptualize this a bit, in a continuously grazed pasture, stocking rate and stocking density are the same. As you subdivide that pasture into smaller paddocks, your stocking density goes up, but your stocking rate stays the same because we have not changed the number of animals. Okay, so stocking density is that point in time, and stocking rate is the average over the grazing season, over the whole grazing platform. The other cool thing about stocking density is it also is a way of describing how those livestock are impacting the plants and the soil and kind of that landscape level impact. So one thing we know about how stocking density changes animal behavior is that as we increase stocking density, animals get less selective. And that sounds on the surface like it might be a bad thing when we know we want really high quality forage for those dairy cows, but actually it can be a very useful tool. So in the early spring, grasses are naturally very vegetative. They're young, they're growing a lot of leaf material, they're very high quality. If we turn the cows out with a relatively high stocking density, they're going to graze just about everything. And when we move them on and that grass regrows and they come back, pretty much all of those pasture plants are going to be at a similar stage of maturity. If our stocking density is lower and they're selecting what they want to graze the first time around, some of those plants will have been set back in their growth by the grazing. And the plants that didn't get grazed are going to keep on growing and maturing uninterrupted. So that's how we start to get some of those over mature plants in our pasture, as well as plants that the cows are going to be like, "Oop, this is the youngest, most delicious stuff. I'm going to eat that." So by actively thinking about what the stocking density is when we're turning out those cows can really help us start the year well in terms of how selective they're being, and then carry that through each subsequent grazing pass. So once we get above about 100,000 pounds of cattle weight per acre, that's when we start seeing very little selective behavior. Their distribution across the pasture is pretty uniform, and we can really see that animal impact. So stocking density is our #1 tool for keeping pastures in that vegetative state and keeping high quality grass in front of those cows. However, the grass is going to head out at some point. It's a biological requirement. This is what grasses do. And all of them are going to head out sometime before the summer solstice, usually late May through to mid-June, depending on the species and the variety, but they are definitely going to head out before the longest day of the year. And Well, this particular photo is not not a pasture that's been mowed. I included it because it's a great contrast. So this is a beef farmer who put some cross fencing up in his pasture, and he mows strips to put that cross fencing up for two reasons. One, so that he doesn't have as much load on the fence and it carries a better shock. But two, so that the cattle can actually see it before they run into it. But you can see where he's mowed to get his fence in, that this is really nice leafy growth compared to the stuff that has gotten a lot more mature. So which one's going to be more digestible? The stuff that's been mowed under the fence. If this was a dairy scenario, which one's going to make more components? The stuff that's been mowed under the fence. So mowing is a fantastic tool to just help maintain that quality. Not necessarily after every single pass, but definitely kind of as we get up to that summer solstice, doing a mow that can just help reset everything can be really, really helpful. Another technique that can help keep that high quality grass in front of the cows is choosing grass species that only head out once. There are some species that every time there's a cutting or a grazing event, they'll grow some new leaves, they'll tiller a bit, and then they'll go back through stem elongation and enter reproductive growth stages. There are other species that once they've headed out once, they mostly just grow leafy material for the rest of the year. And it's much easier to keep a pasture in a vegetative, leafy, high quality state if we select those species rather than the ones that keep trying to set seed. So some of the most common of our grass species that generally only head out once are orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, and perennial ryegrass. Not every one of these species is going to be the right fit for every farm, but knowing that they all kind of share this characteristic of not heading out more than once can be really useful when you're trying to come up with a pasture mix. I did make a note about tall fescue, particularly for dairy, but also for everybody else, soft leaf varieties only, and I will expand on that in another slide or two. Okay. If anyone has talked to a seed sales rep in the last couple of years, they may have mentioned festuloliums as an option to put into a pasture mix or a hay mix. And I know that definitely the dairy sector is getting a fair bit of marketing in this direction. So I just wanted to talk a bit about what festuloliums are, because they're not one thing and they're a little more complicated than a lot of people realize. So festuloliums are a hybrid between a fescue and a ryegrass. So the Latin name for fescue is festuca, and the Latin name for ryegrass is lolium. So festuca and lolium, you get festulolium, and it's a perfect example of why plant breeders should not be allowed to name things, because nobody can pronounce that. But the idea behind crossing fescues and ryegrasses was to try to get the winter hardiness of the fescue and the palatability and digestibility of the ryegrass into one plant. Now, depending on what hybrid you get, the parent fescue could be a tall fescue, or it could be a meadow fescue. The parent ryegrass could be perennial ryegrass or Italian ryegrass, which more commonly in Ontario is called annual ryegrass. That's a misnomer. It used to winter kill pretty reliably, but Italian ryegrass is actually a short-lived perennial, and perennial ryegrass lives longer. But either way, there's sort of 4 possible combinations of fescue and ryegrass that you might get in a hybrid festulolium. The other thing that affects what kinds of traits these grasses have is the variety of each parent species that went into that cross. And that will affect things like yield potential and heading date and persistence and how upright the growth is, etc. So festuloliums can get complicated really quickly. The best advice I have for farmers is if you buy seed and there's a festulolium in the mix, or it's festulolium just as a straight seed, write down the hybrid name. Because if you like it, you can go back and ask the seed company for more of that hybrid. And if you hate it, you can go back and say, okay, that was the wrong Festulolium for me. What else have you got? Because some of these really thrive in a grazing environment. Some of them really thrive as hay or baleage or haylage. And some of them are more dual purpose. And it kind of depends. And much of the literature that I see coming up from seed companies doesn't clearly articulate the exact management conditions that each of these hybrids work really well for. So the best thing you can do as a farmer is if you buy a Festulolium, write down the hybrid name, and then you can have a more constructive conversation with the seed rep, depending on whether you like it or you hate it. The other consideration when we're trying to get cows to milk off of pasture is, we can keep that pasture in a vegetative state for as much of the year as possible. And we can use stocking density and mowing to do that. And we can pick species that don't head out very much. But at the end of the day, the pasture also has to be palatable. And this is a word that gets thrown around in grazing circles a lot, but doesn't necessarily come up in other aspects of feeding livestock. So palatable just means that it's acceptable or satisfactory. So ideas can be palatable, forage can be palatable. And when livestock are determining palatability of forage, they're using their senses of smell and taste, and they're also using their sense of feel. They're looking at they're feeling out the texture. So I flagged tall fescue needing to be a soft leaf variety a couple of slides ago. And I'm sure many of you can find an older pasture field somewhere near you sometime like May or June. If you go out there and you find a tall fescue plant, grab it kind of by the base and slide your hand up the leaves. And it's definitely going to be rough. You may end up with paper cuts, kind of like grass cut paper cuts on your hand. A lot of those older fescue varieties are really coarse and really sharp, and livestock hate eating them. So palatability is another variable that we want to consider when we're making pasture mixes, but it's a much harder one to assess without trying it and seeing what the cows think. Because even when we had third-party variety trials happening on forage crops in Ontario, they weren't assessing palatability. They were looking at yield, they were looking at heading date. Sometimes they would run laboratory quality tests to get a sense of forage quality. But palatability is something that is very difficult for us as humans to accurately assess all the time for livestock. So just that hand grab test is a great one to start, but smell and taste we're not very good at because we're not herbivores. Okay. So that was my little crash course on the biggest issue for both sheep and dairy cows. My contact information is up on the screen. I guess one other comment that I will make, I know that this talk, I really tried to hone in on sheep and dairy cows, but a lot of the parasite management stuff will apply to anyone raising ruminants organically as well, because our sheep sector is very limited. They've only got 1, maybe 2 active ingredients in their dewormers. And also anyone trying to raise organic cattle, whether that's beef or dairy, they're also going to be limited in terms of drugs they can use. So those techniques may be helpful in an organic setting. And like I said during the dairy talk, yeah, any other animals that have a very high plane of nutrition, so grass finishing beef or grass finishing lambs, the advice on keeping that pasture vegetative is going to be really pertinent too.
A question has come up now with regards to pasture rejuvenation via frost seeding. Do you have any tips for post-seeding rest period or the recommendation for the first spring turnout then after frost seeding?
Right. Yeah. So anytime that we overseed, whether it's frost seeding or drilling something into an established stand, those young plants are going to be a little more sensitive. So ideally, we don't want to graze them until after the crown is fully developed. So the crown is like the little bump at the soil surface between the stem and the roots. That little bumpy bit is the crown. So that first grazing of the year, ideally don't take it as tight, right? So if you've let the grass grow up and you're letting the livestock graze down, maybe leave more residual behind than you normally would, just so that they're not pulling up those new seedlings by the roots. So that's one way to protect them. Again, in terms of time, it really comes down more to plant development stages and plant growth than it comes down to days, weeks, months, which can be difficult because plant growth depends a lot on weather conditions.
All right, I think we have gone through all the questions in the chat. That is great. Any final closing comments, Christine?
Just that we've only scratched the surface on sheep and dairy, and it was an interesting challenge trying to cram both of them into one talk that would fit into a webinar. But I had fun. I hope you guys had fun.
Okay.
Pro tip.
All right. Thank you very much, Christine. And we just want to finally again thank our sponsors for Profitable Pastures generally for all 3 webinars. That was Beef Farmers of Ontario and Royal LePage RCR Realty. And this evening's sponsor specifically for tonight's talk was the Ontario Sheep Farmers. So thank you again to those. Thank you, Christine. With that, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us.